So this is going to be a redo of a old series I did when I first started this video on the House of Hurin. Only I am now expanding it to the house of his brother Huor as well. Reason being that first, it was one of my earlier videos and the audio sucked, so you have that. Also too, some of my views have kind of evolved and changed a bit since then. And I think that that's reflected in his brother's house, Huor. So I decided to include them in it as well. And I also want to try and make them shorter. So having said that, let's start with Hurin and just why basically he's considered more or less the John Wick of the First Age. And if you stick through to the end of this video, you'll understand why that is not an understatement or a clickbait. I think of Hurin almost like I think of the dwarves, short in stature, but mighty in mind, body, and spirit. Hurin, along with his younger brother Huor, were of the House of Hador in Dor-Lomin, and he came of age during the most violent years of the Beleriand Wars. His own grandfather, Hador, hence the name, had been killed defending the rear guard of High King Fingolfin, and he received the full baptism of war during the Dagor-Bragollach War. He had a reputation for being hot-tempered and extremely stubborn, but I think it's almost implied that this also made him naturally charismatic and a great leader. He wasn't a bad guy, just a bad-tempered guy apparently. Hurin basically was a warrior's warrior. If the legendarium is anything to go by, he was the preeminent warrior of humanity throughout all of the three ages. That's first, second, and third. But there was also more to Hurin than just war and being a warrior, even though that's a major part. To contrast his yang to his proclivity of violence, there was also the yang that he was also a man of faith. Besides surviving and thriving under the Noldor of the Hithlum Mountains, he and his brother were the only humans to have ever seen the glory that was Gondolin, arguably the most beautiful city to have existed in Middle-earth outside of Valinor. And I think these elements fathered in him a faith that while the elves were not invincible per se, they were still on the right side of history. They were the righteous ones, if you will. Hurin seems to have sensed that despite all the wrong the Noldor had done, or at least as what the Noldor of Gondolin had educated him in the first place, that there was still some external righteousness that was on their side and supporting them low-key somehow, no matter how dark the times were or how awful the enemy was. And this was a defining quality to him that defined him even up until his death. That because of his faith in the Noldor, he still believed that they would right the wrongs of Morgoth and what he's done to Middle-earth. This is even and despite the doubt and practicality of his wife, Morwen, which I will go into during that video, the disastrous war of the Narniaeth or Nordiad, which led to his capture and his brother's death, and even to basically spit in the face of the devil himself, Morgoth. And I can't undersell enough that last point, because Morgoth was notorious, mind you, for causing beings to submit to him by his sheer presence and power alone. This included Maiar, Valar, elves, and men. You could literally count on one hand the rare few who could look the Valar directly in the face and essentially tell him to go fuck himself. And again, that is not an exaggeration. Because that's essentially what Hurin did, though in a much more Tolkienian way, obviously. By telling him that no matter how long it might take, that the narcissistic spirit baby was weak and will be defeated at some point in time, one way or the other. And if Morgoth can't handle anything, it's being to have truth bonds laid on him that he low-key knows, but is just in a constant denial about. This was made all the more insulting by the fact that this was coming from a mortal, someone or something who was so far beneath him on the evolutionary scale that calling Hurin an ant would be an insult to ants. This is also what makes Hurin, though, the embodiment of the hope of all the Edain prior to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, embodying and symbolizing who the Edain were before that particular war. Yet, this was the prideful, faithful, and violent nature of Hurin of the House of Hador, because wherever his arrogance or strength came from, it also prompted him to defy high kings and gods to their faces and not fear death. Equally, this also made him not the best family man also. He was often away from his family, had missed the death of his first daughter, I believe, the Leith, during a plague, had a complicated but loving relationship with Morwen because of their different views and somewhat different experiences, and was not around his son Turin long enough to impart to him any lesson of humility or patience that he may have learned from the Eldar or his time living. Lessons that certainly would have helped his son later on. In fact, in the book, The Children of Hurin, it's Turin who remarks that at one point that he often thought that his father preferred the company of elves to even that of his own race. It was these aspects, I think, that Morgoth recognized as well, and why he put his family on his personal hit list. When Hurin was released by Morgoth, much after he was well over 100 years old, Hurin still hadn't surrendered to him. But Morgoth used his presence and his blind spot of his pride to do more damage to the remaining free peoples of Beleriand than he would have if he had not let him go, with Hurin essentially committing genocide by killing the last of the petty dwarves to avenge his son Turin, starting a civil war in Brethil, and once again cussing out another High King and Divine Spirit to their faces. Man, I love this guy. Because the other and last aspect of Hurin was that he was also someone who believed in justice. Yes, Hurin was a warlike person. Violence and temper may have fueled his body. Faith in the Noldor may have given him purpose. But it was a radically strong sense of justice that gave him a point to focus all those previous elements on. And again, no matter who or what they were going to get both barrels. And the word consequences meant nothing to this man. And it was this that Morgoth was finally able to use to manipulate this core aspect that finally succeeded, or at least nearly succeeded, in breaking the John Wick of the Beleriand Wars. Because Morgoth, in his infantile rage, I guess you can say, finally realized that intimidation was not going to work with this person, that violence was not going to work with this person, that even threats to his family was not going to work with Hurin of the House of Hador. He had to be more underhanded. He had to be more cruel. He had to be more malicious in intent than he had ever had been. And again, arguably, whether you think that actually broke him or not, since he does, it's said at least anyway, unalive himself by jumping off a cliff, it's up to you to decide whether he was finally broken or not. Or, like he says in the book The Silmarillion, that, quote, he was a thrall of Morgoth no longer. This is the Miller Philosopher, and this video is now going to be on Huor of the House of Hador. And actually, this is an addition that I made to explore Hurin's younger brother, because I felt that essentially that what happens to Huor and his immediate family within the larger family of the House of Hador kind of plays off of that of his brother, Hurin. And to neglect one would be to neglect the other in a way, if you get my meaning. Also, too, and just without an expectation here, the relationship between Huor and his brother is a lot like, I think anyway, what you see in Boromir and Faramir, if you want a reference point for that. Now, honestly, Huor is one of the harder ones to do, and there's going to be some speculation here and theorizing, because quite frankly, there's just not a lot to go on that Tolkien ever wrote about him in detail, like he did with the character of Hurin. And I suppose that's because that despite him being the father of Tuor and the grandfather of Earndil, the man himself apparently didn't warrant as much character development, which kind of sucks in a way, no offense to Tolkien. But it also wouldn't have been the first time that Tolkien had written up a major character whose importance lies solely in their lineage rather than their individual actions. Now, that being said, what can be gathered about Huor is that he was the younger brother of Hurin and fought his first major battle around 13 years old. He also grew to be taller than his brother, ironically, and this is actually a family trait overall. Despite this, though, he is still always mentioned in Trail of Hurin, not exactly as an afterthought, but you could almost argue with not much agency either. The one moment where Huor is specifically mentioned on his own merit and actions is during the closing days of the Arneath where, while defending King Turgon and his soldiers who were retreating, ended up prophesying on his own volition that their children would spawn the salvation of Beleriand. That Huor often followed after his older brother is no great surprise either. They're brothers in war, after all. And the Edain, as an overall culture before the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, were known for their tight kinship bonds, even between the notoriously isolationist Halidin at that point in time in its history. However, his name in Sindarin also means fiery spirit, and if taken in the Noldor context, it also means vigor and courage. So, by this, I take it that Huor may have followed Hurin in their adventures, but it wasn't out of a sense of weakness or some kind of submission. I would almost rather say that they were both very much alike, so that it was a co-decision, with Huor only deferring to Hurin in matters of great importance, as he was the younger brother, even though he was also the taller brother. And while his name can imply fiery spirit, I also get the impression that Huor may have also been actually the more cooler-headed of the Sons of Hador. Now, I'm basing this assumption off his relationship to Rian, who he marries later on, who was a pacifist at heart, and was so devoted to him that she went to go look for him on the battlefield of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, despite him already being dead. Now, let me ask you this real quick. Why the devotion from Rian if she didn't see something that she liked in Huor in the first place, especially after he is presumed dead? And what would a pacifist of all people find anything appealing in a warrior, especially a warrior of the House of Hador, which was pretty much famous for being warlike people? As well as the confirmed fact, of course, that Huor is also not named as one of the mightiest heroes of the First Age, which also kind of sucks, but that title instead goes to his brother and his nephew. Many of the characters that Tolkien writes as great warriors seem to share this trait of being ill-tempered and very trigger-happy. Fëanor, Fingolfin, Eärnur, Boromir, and the race of dwarves are general examples of this. Rather, Huor and the rest of his line, for a large part, were known for keen insight in critical moments, as well as battlefield skill, but went beyond that. And this takes nothing from Huor at all. It was just a different type of renown, I guess you can say. Moreover, going by what the Silmarillion says about his son's arrival at Gondolin years later, Huor made apparently quite an impression during his stay there, as it played a large part in the Noldor of Gondolin's acceptance of his son years later as one of their own, despite being mortal. And in my own headcanon, I can almost see Eärndil, Turgon's daughter, being somewhat drawn to him, but just not necessarily romantically. And this would explain why she was so drawn romantically to his son, who would have been some resemblance to him. And again, that's just my headcanon, nothing gross there. That being said, what can be certain is this, is that Tuor was extremely loyal to his family, even going off to war while only 2 months recently married, with a pregnant wife. And while I don't think this was out of any disrespect to Rian, his wife, because it is implied that they did love each other greatly, that Hurin and Huor were brothers in arms and war as well as blood. All their battles to that point were fought together, and there was just simply no way in hell he was going to let his brother go off to war in what was supposed to be the last great offensive of the Beleriand Wars, one that his brother might not come back from. And these are the ideas that came to mind when I looked at Huor as a person and as a character in Tolkien's books. Morwen is one of my favorite characters of the First Age because of how unique she is to the lore overall of Tolkien's Middle-earth, as well as her family. Of Hurin's immediate family, she and her second child, Lilith, are the only ones who did not unalive themselves. In fact, you could almost argue that of the entire family of Hurin, that she's the only one who more or less escaped Morgoth's wrath because of that fact as well. But, as we know, this does not mean that she had a happy life either. Far from it. Now, without repeating too many of the well-known points, Morwen was from Dorthonion in the north central of Beleriand and belonged to the royal House of Hador, easily the most notable human royalty of Beleriand, and also making her related to Beren. I'm sure we all remember that guy. So, she had a front row seat to the Dagor War, as her nation was on the central front, bearing the brunt of the conflict. And, as Dorthonion and its elven allies eventually fell to Morgoth, the royal house and their remaining allies resorted to guerrilla warfare to continue the fight. And if details from Beren's day as a resistance fighter is anything to go by, it's not hard for me to see Morwen actually taking part in the guerrilla fighting as well before she and the other women reluctantly left them, their husbands, brothers, nephews, and so on, in order to migrate to Dor-lómin. And these facts already tell us a great deal about Morwen. She was a princess, essentially, until her home fell, then became a refugee, possibly a resistance fighter, and then an immigrant to Bethrel and Dor-lómin when she left. Anyone who has dealt with or known people with these kind of backgrounds in real life know that there is a lot of PTSD at work here, and this is topped with also a good dose of cynicism and internalized darkness that never leaves her. And this is exactly how Tolkien basically describes Morwen as well after she marries Hurin. She is the yang to Hurin's yin, essentially. Where Hurin had an absolute faith in the eventual elven victory over Morgoth, Morwen did not. Now, like her husband, Morwen too had witnessed the glory of the legendarium prior to the Dagor, and she had also seen it fall. She knew the stories of where the Noldor came from and why they came to Middle-earth, and none of that mattered. And she has tried to tell her husband this from time to time, but though Hurin loves her, he never truly accepts her truth. Again, this is the irony between her and her husband, that while they were so much alike, they also couldn't be more opposite of each other. And yet, they still somehow loved each other. Quite frankly, that's amazing. Now, while Hurin was no stranger to the hard life of Middle-earth as well, struggle and war and so on, he had also never been a refugee. He had never been hunted down. He had never lost everything that he's ever known like Morwen had. And in this, you could argue that Hurin was actually kind of naive. Morwen's early life had turned her from a highborn princess into a hardcore survivor, and this shows after the Naeth-Arnardiad War. Morwen was already regarded as essentially being something of a cold-hearted bitch, quite frankly, by the locals. Or, to put it even more so in modern lingo, she had no chill. She was well known for being extremely blunt and extremely rude, besides extremely tall and extremely intimidating and beautiful. Even her own family had a similar, if not scathing, view of her. Besides being physically imposing with her height, she showed very little emotion to all around her, even when her second child had died from the plague. Her grief only exposed itself briefly once, and that was in private. And it was the same when she sent Turin away to Doriath as well. I think Morwen's earlier life had taught her that feelings such as open compassion and empathy were weaknesses that could be your end. That if you wanted to survive an occupation, if you wanted to survive being hunted down, if you wanted to live through hard times, you needed to be made of harder stuff. But the occupying Easterlings that invaded Dor-lómin after the war took this idea one step further, seeing her as something of a witch rather than as one of the local women who was forced into marriage, and as such left both her and her family alone. And that tells you something about the force of presence that she had. Yet, despite her coldness, Morwen was also 100% committed to her family. She only sent Turin away after life in occupied Dor-lómin became too much. Even then, she maintains constant communication with him, via elven messengers, until this too also becomes impossible due to outside circumstances. Soon after Turin leaves, she gives birth to her second daughter, Nienor, and leaves her home for now the second time, to now migrate to Doriath in order to find Turin again and to raise her family and be with them in safety. And when she finds out that Turin is no longer there, at some point decides to go after him again. And this is set against the wisdom of High King Thingol and his queen Melian. This is more or less the last we hear of Morwen until decades later, when she miraculously is reunited with her long presumed dead husband Hurin at the gravestone of their children in Brethil. Now, all this sounds like I'm putting kind of a negative spin on Morwen, but I'm not. In fact, I would argue that she actually out-Hurins Hurin. She's more mule-headed, more stubborn, and more proud than him, I think. She is more durable than Hurin's already tremendous durability, having had to endure 2 forced migrations under hostile circumstances and lost loved ones in the process, and yet still continues to move forward. The only difference between her and her husband is that her focus is on her family, whereas Hurin's was on the military life and the elves. And the ultimate symbol of Morwen's toughness being that, as I said from the start of the video, that she was the only one of the adult members of Hurin's family that did not unalive themselves, nor take her own life to surrender or despair. The fact that Turin himself notes when he's holding her as she finally dies. And this is why I express my own opinion that she's basically the only one in the family that escapes Morgoth's wrath, at least as far as in her own body and mind. This by no means takes nothing away from the rest of her family. There's a reason why they're all legends that are passed down so that even their names carry far off into the Third Age. And given how little the legacy of the First Age matters to your common person in the Third Age, that's a major feat. And Morwen was for certain a damaged woman because of her experiences. But you know what she also is? Morwen is someone who made the best with what she had, no matter what life and war took from her and threw at her. And that is why I think she is more than just a badass and more than earns her last name, Steelsheen. This is a Miller philosopher. And for this part of the House of Hador, I'm taking on Rian. Now, Rian is a difficult character to pin down among the House of Hador because, like her husband, so very little is said about her, and that her impact personally onto the story of the family is extremely limited, save that she's the mother of Tuor. And to be honest, I almost didn't do a video on her for that very reason. Again, as I said in the previous video on Huor, it's not the first time that Tolkien wrote up a character whose only major purpose was the lineage. Now, brief factoid overview is that she was of the royal house of Beor from the Thornian, thus making her a cousin of Beren and Morwen, and more or less a princess. When the Dagor-Bragolak War had started, she was only a child when the realm fell to Morgoth, so this also makes her a refugee during the time of the guerrilla fighting. Though, given that she was a young girl at the time, I doubt she saw any actual combat. And, as I said before, when things got really bad, the remaining women and children reluctantly left to go flee to Dor-lómin, while the men remained and died in Dor-lómin, mostly. With the refugees, Rian came into the free lands of Dor-lómin eventually and came to live there, now safe, supposedly, from the forces of Morgoth, thanks to the Mordor elves of Hithlum. Now later on, she ends up marrying Huor when she's about 23 years old, brother of Hurin. And for about 2 months, she had a happy life with them and even got pregnant. But 2 months later, he was cut off the war and never returned, with Rian being pregnant and knowing very little of what happened other than that they lost and that it was from the betrayal of the Easterlings. Speaking of which, when the Easterling colonizers did come, she fled into the woods and was basically rescued by the great elves of Mithrim. She gave birth to her son, Tuor, left him in charge of the elves, and then went off to the battlefield of the Arneath and Nordiad, finding the Hill of the Slain of Unthaglith. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And it was there that Rian pretty much saw the remains and just laid there and died, apparently. Now, already from this, we get a picture of someone who wasn't a scene stealer, as it were. Despite also being a refugee and suffering through war and migration like her cousin Morwen, she turns out nothing like her. In fact, it says that she pretty much, in modern terminologies, is a pacifist. She saw no joy or anything admirable in any kind of violence whatsoever, and preferred the peace of nature of Middle-earth, and making and singing songs to that of hunting, war, and the typical things that people did back then, I guess. And I think there's a lot of symbolism in these things, that essentially the beauty and peace of the First Age withering away before the death and destruction wrought by the wars, ultimately symbolized within her, given the fact that she got married at 20 and then died when she was 23 years old. Didn't even know her husband for a year, if we're just going by when they were married. Who knows how long the courtship was. From this little information, though, I was able to see something of a pattern. And again, this is speculation, so please bear with me. I think Rian was just as scarred by the fall of her country like her cousins, but this manifested differently. This is not to say that she loved war prior to the Dagor Bragollach, but she certainly came to hate it afterwards, after losing her family and home, and then suffering through the trek of Drolomin, after suffering and having to eat God knows what just to survive while being hunted down. So to me, it would make sense that she would turn towards anything opposite of that. And speaking of which, and I'm just speculating here, I think she would have seen the warrior tradition of Drolomin, especially in Hurin himself, as a massive turnoff. Hence what I say about her and Huor in my video on Huor. It says something about Huor's character that Rian was so devoted to him to even seek him out when he was most likely presumed dead. And I think it can be inferred that while being similar to his brother in many ways, Huor was also more of a gentler and less aggressive person than Hurin, as much as anyone from the House of Hador can go. And I think that was what most likely drew Rian to him, because again, as I said in the previous video, why the hell would a pacifist be drawn to marry a warrior? Just saying. Rian somehow, somewhere, had learned about why the allies had lost the Battle of Outnumbered Tears, and how that was because of the Easterlings, and that apparently she told this to her infant son, who, for whatever reason, somehow was able to remember all this. To me, though, this implies perhaps a deep anger and resentment, at the very least, towards the one responsible for her husband's death and taking away the bliss that was her life at that point in time. Moreover, there's also the question of why she died the way she did. I mean, think about it. There were plenty of other widows that had also lost their husbands, brothers, cousins, and other family members during the wars, after all. Yet none of them, as far as we can tell anyway, died or unalived themselves, other than what we get to the House of Hurin, of course. This is where the legacy of Rian's early life comes into play for her future. She already hated violence and fled from it. For a time, it seemed like she was safe from it and was prospering well enough in Drolomin, the tragedies of Darthurnian being far away in both distance and now memory. It's a much lighter version of what happened with Nienor after her encounter with Glaurung, but also still serious. Yet, that particular war, the Battle of Outnumbered Tears, brought all the tragedy back to her, repeating the horrors and sufferings that she had endured as a child. And again, this is speculation, but I think she couldn't bear it anymore. I'm talking major PTSD, of course. With the specter or loss ever pursuing her, never allowing Rian to have any peace whatsoever before it tried to take it away from her. While Rian's one light left in the world was her son, in whom she believed that was going to be the salvation of Beleriand, it wasn't going to be enough to heal the wounds from her past that she was now actively bleeding out with, metaphorically speaking. And when I read about her death on the Mount of the Dead, I always picture her somehow seeing her husband's body or somehow recognizing it somehow, and that was when and where she just literally gave up life and just died basically. So Rian is a tragic character in that she is one of those characters like the Laith who, unfortunately and quite frankly, was simply too weak to make it in Beleriand during its wars. And I'm not saying this to punch down on her at all. It's just that was her personality. Rian is a person who would have thrived in Valinor or the first half of the Second Age in Numenor, when there were times were prosperous and where there was no threat of war or having what you love being ripped from you. But unfortunately, that was not her situation, and things happened the way that they did. This is Miller Philosopher, and I just want to say first off that if you are still continuing with this series, I want to thank you for your time and how much time you are choosing to listen to this. If you don't make it to the whole thing, that's perfectly fine. That being said, Turin is easily one of Tolkien's top 3 most nuanced and complicated characters in all the legendarium. And what inspired me to do the original series of videos in the first place was about him in respect to everything that happened to him in his life that was supposed to be a result of the curse laid upon him via his father Hurin by Morgoth. Now, I've always had a problem with this because when I read the Silmarillion, multiple times mind you, I don't get the impression at all that Turin, and for that matter his sister Nienor, were ill-fated. This isn't to say that Morgoth didn't try to place some sort of curse on him or something along those lines, but we'll get to that. The problem I see with Turin is more rooted in his upbringing. He was born during a time of peace, but to 2 diametrically opposed parents. A military father who was oftentimes more abroad than at home, so much so that Turin himself thought that Hurin preferred the company of elves to those of his own family and race, and a mother who was a hardcore survivor from a previous war and extremely difficult migration, experiences that made her icy and cold upon all who first come upon her and knew anything of her, Morwen. Now, Turin took more of his mother's composure than his father's because of this experience, and that's sad, because if Hurin knew anything about calm composure and patience that he may have learned, he could have taught that to his son. But as it is, between his mother's influence and the loss of his sister, which also had a drastic effect on him, Turin becomes hard and borderline cynical, but at the same time also compassionate. And that compassion being topped off with a need to protect those who are in pain or just in need of protection in general, whether it be his family or any who's under his charge. Turin, put simply, was an extremely rash and angry person with little to no self-control over his impulses. But this wasn't for evil purposes or even directly self-centered purposes as well, though at times his ego will come into play. Because of the loss that he experienced early on of his sister and his father, Turin feels a need to protect those around him and feels the most pain and anguish when he's unable to do so. You could even argue that any time that he does so is him projecting his issues of loss onto other people. But there's also another factor that comes into play here, that what he does get from his father is his natural stubbornness and natural warrior prowess that makes him the second greatest warrior of the First Age. He was taller and even more charismatic than Hurin, and these elements coalesce into a superiority complex that was built on an inferiority complex. When not losing his temper or going insane, Turin genuinely believes that he knows what's best for those he views under his charge because of his natural abilities. This was why in Nargothrond he refutes the idea to not build a bridge that leads directly into Nargothrond over the river. This was why he never returned to Doriath after being pardoned by the king for, I guess you would call it, elf slaughter of a musician who insulted his family. This is why he chose to lead the expedition to go out to kill Glaurung in his final days in Brethil. Yes, Turin does have a tremendous ego and is at play during most of these cases. He preferred to fight in open warfare rather than using guerrilla tactics or stealth, just like his father. The whole reason he was on the run in Doriath was because he lost his shit after the family insult. And regarding the petty dwarf meme, He just literally forgot about him when his friend Beleg joins his fellowship of rebel fighters. But none of these were the main reasons that motivated him. Yet, having said that, these are also still colossal fuck-ups. And you can tell that these wear on him over time, coming to an eventual belief that he is cursed after he finds out from an Aemon escapee, Gwyndor, that his father was in fact still alive, but had a curse placed on him because of mouthing off to Morgoth. And while this does somewhat humble Turin, it also compounds upon his issues of self-control, making him increasingly paranoid, somehow feeling that the long fingers of Morgoth were reaching out to grab and crush him. And from this point on, Turin feels that he's always trying to outrun fate, as it were. This manifests in using alter egos when he's brought into Nargothrond and later Brethil, believing that his birth name will somehow reactivate the curse or somehow allow Morgoth to zero in on his position, I guess. And it's in fact Gwyndor who, after selling him out by betraying his own name to the Noldor elves, is the one who tells Turin that the curse of Morgoth lies within himself, not his name. Quite simply put, that nearly everything bad that's happened to Turin during this time did so because he was making very, very, very bad decisions. Turin is not a fool though. In fact, if anything, the two elements that seem to counterbalance his negative traits are his exceptional skill in war and his strong sense of loyalty. And yes, again, compassion to those in need. Turin is not like Fëanor, nor even a Fëanor light, who, in the depth of his power, prowess, and madness, gave zero fucks about anyone or anything else. And keep in mind, this is coming from a Fëanor fan, mind you. And I would also argue that Turin actually does mature. He does grow, he does evolve. And this is shown by not initially marrying his forcibly amnesiac sister, Nienor, now known as Nienel, in Brethil, despite the fact that she was pressing him for marriage. And this is also keeping in mind the fact that Turin and Nienor knew nothing about each other than the other existed. But they had never seen each other other than that. Though I wonder if they ever saw a family resemblance, maybe? I don't know. Anyhow, you could almost argue that in a way that Turin almost succeeds and thwarts the curse because he wouldn't be setting up Glaurung's reveal to Nienel about her identities, made all the worse by her pregnancy as a result of said marriage when he finally does cave. It's worth diving into what would have happened had he had chosen not to marry Nienel, actually. And perhaps I'll do a separate video on that at some point in the future. So, that being said, if there is any larger framework at play here, I would say, in my secondary opinion, as a fan of Tolkien and as a reader of the story, that Turin and Nienor represented the state of the Edain post-Battle of Unnumbered Tears. That prior to the war, the people were overall very hopeful and prosperous despite recovering from the Dagor War and other similar skirmishes. A belief in the eventual downfall of Morgoth and the victory of the elves, that things were going to work out. However, after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, they were just fucking lost at that point. That faith is completely shattered and broken, and it's destroyed, and everything from that point on for the Edain, as well as the remaining elf realms, is about survival and trying to stay the hell out of Morgoth's crosshairs. And how this state is a steadily decaying situation where now even the smallest mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. And not all of them coming from Morgoth. So that being said, this is why I also think that Turin was not making his decisions under a curse, because all these decisions are being made by his own impulses. For the most part, you can basically argue that no one's making him do anything. Hell, no one can make him do anything. I'll take that one step further. No one can make anyone in his family do anything because he was that strong-willed, he was that stubborn. So anything that, as Gwyndor says, happened to Turin that was evil was because of his own choices. And even the encounter with Glaurung was not ordained because for the most part, Glaurung didn't know where he was. Yes, he knew that he was a guerrilla fighter at some point in a local area, but other than that, he didn't really know anything. He wasn't planning on encountering him at Nargothrond or during the battle beforehand. And he was sure as hell not planning on encountering him in Brethil later on when he's killed by said Turin. And those are my thoughts basically on Turin, fate, and just how, like his father, he is a badass, but he's also a complicated and kind of a fucked up badass as well. This is a Miller philosopher, and if you couldn't tell by now, Hurin's family is incredibly complex and complicated. And if more casuals knew about their story, I'm convinced that it would put to rest the stereotype that J.R.R. Tolkien writes simplistic stories of good versus evil. By far, the most complicated of them is the second daughter of Hurin and Morwen, Nienor. Short version is this. She's born after Turin is sent to Doriath, lives with her mother Morwen, migrates with her to Doriath from occupied Dorloman, disobeys her when she is told to stay for her own safety, runs into Glaurung while searching for her brother, has a mental battle with him and loses, has amnesia forced upon her by Glaurung, and she ends up fleeing, lost in the woods, discovered by Halidin, who then re-educate her, and taking on a new name, Nienel. Finds Turin, though unknown to her who he actually is, or vice versa, and yet is still immediately drawn to him. Forces him, more or less, into a marriage and gets pregnant. Glaurung returns, and Turin leads a sortie to take him out, but is presumed lost. Nienel is told that Turin is dead and runs off again to find him. She finds him with Glaurung, thinking that he's dead, but then Glaurung wakes up, reveals the truth to Nienel before he finally dies, and Nienel, in immense despair, crashes out and jumps to her death from a ledge. So, that's a fucking lot.
What? What the fuck?
That's why the original video was so long, actually. So I'm sticking to basically two themes here. The reason behind her crash out and her relation to Morgoth's curse. So in my opinion, what I essentially think what happened to Nienor was that she basically got hit with a Middle-earth version of multiple personality disorder, so to speak. And let me explain, because I know that someone in the original video kind of didn't like that interpretation, which is fine. Essentially what I mean is that Nienor, for all intents and purposes, was a blonde version of her mother. She had the same cynical and survivalist disposition that was now commonplace among the remaining peoples of Beleriand, with no faith of any kind in deliverance from the Dark Lord of the North. The best they could hope for was to stick together as a family and do their best to stay out of Morgoth's eye. That being said, she also had the traits of her father, being athletic and an incredibly fast runner, as well as also mule-headed and extremely strong-willed. In my opinion, I think had she had been taught to be a warrior like Hurin and Turin, she might well have become the third greatest mortal warrior of the First Age. And no, I'm not being political with that. I mean, like her brother, Nienor even had the balls to try to go toe-to-toe with a dragon in a psychic battle, even though he could have hard-boiled her in a second. And on top of all that, was holding her own in the mental battle for some time before she finally succumbed to Glaurung. Now, compare that to the Noldor elves, who were supposed to be badass and better than mortals, yet were absolutely terrified of the dragon. There you are. Now, Nienor had never met Turin, but through Morwen had already come to love him greatly as a brother, in my opinion. Also thanks in no small part as well to his letters from Doriath while they were still living there before they went to find Turin. However, what was all Nienor's personality was an intense focus on her goals, taking the family trait of stubbornness to a whole other level. Once Nienor had her mind set on something, there was absolutely no changing it. And anything or anyone that tried to get in the way of that, save for occasional family even, was cast aside or just flat out ignored. This trait lasted with her even during her stay in Brethil as Nienel. Now, speaking of this, after her first encounter with Glaurung, nearly all these traits are suppressed into a dark area of her mind, an area that becomes so dreadful and painful from that point on that if anyone comes even close to bringing it up, she flips out. And This is because of what Glaurung essentially did to her was pretty much violate her mind. Amnesia is not a family trait. It was forced on Nienor, and it's what leads to the creation, if you will, of the second personality of Nienel. Now, the reason why I say Nienel is a second personality is because that in almost all ways, she is the polar opposite of Nienor. This to me feels like more than just a memory loss, even though that's at play as well. Having been raised in the relative safety of Brethil, it allows Nienel to develop a kinder personality than the one she had before. She is no longer as stubborn as she once was, and for all intents and purposes, more or less develops a much warmer personality. Perhaps in some twisted ways, this was the only positive effect of the curse, if you still believe that. Other than PTSD though, the other trait that still wasn't buried under the Nienel personality was her sense of family loyalty. She is drawn to Turin for some unknown reason, yet is profound enough that she takes it to be love. She's never met Turin, nor has Turin met her. As I said in the last video, both siblings were aware that the other existed, but had never met each other. And this is even though that Turin as well was going under a different name, just like Nienel was. So it's with these factors in mind that they form a very, very strong bond. So much so that when Brander, out of a jealous rage, tells her that her husband is dead, Nienel flat out rejects it and runs off to find him. So what happens in the end is that essentially these two personas, if you will, are what finally caused her breakdown. Nienor and Nienel were two complete opposites in the same body. The Nienor persona was now back in charge, and I don't think she could handle the sudden reveal of what her life had been like as a Nienel. No hints or no prep time whatsoever to get ready for it. It was a second violation from the dragon because Glaurung again had forced her to remember that dark place in her mind that she had spent so much effort trying to avoid and forget. Nienel had done things with her brother that she never would have if she had been in her right mind as Nienor. And all this was ultimately compounded by the fact that now she was also pregnant with their child. A child of incest, mind you. And this isn't Game of Thrones where shit like that flies all the time. In the world of Tolkien, this kind of thing is one of the most serious offenses that one could commit. So, all that being said, what about my second point, that she was a victim of Morgoth's curse? Well, I think, like her brother, that Nienor wasn't as much a victim of a supernatural curse, but rather circumstances based on how her story plays out. Now, while you could argue that her first encounter with Glaurung was fated, I would counter that it need not have happened at all if she had just listened to her mother and stayed in Doriath. Nienor suffered the same flaw as the rest of her family. She was extremely stubborn, arguably the most stubborn out of all of them. Moreover, Glaurung didn't even know where Nienor, Turin, or Morwen were at that time. He was just sent out to wreck shit and told by Morgoth, oh, and by the way, if you run into these people, make their lives hell. Hence why he doesn't kill the children of Hurin on sight. If Nienor is the victim of anything from Morgoth, it's that she was made a personal target of interest and bore the worst of his malice more than any of her family. That her theme within the Silmarillion narrative as a whole was one of embodying the fall of the Edain. From barely surviving the apocalyptic battle of unnumbered tears, to falling into such a state of disrepair and desperation that even unaliving yourself now was becoming an option to people. And it is these factors that make her such a tragic figure in Tolkien's legendarium and in the family overall, and yet at the same time, I feel anyway, does not take anything away from her whatsoever, because there was greatness there that was just never realized or just manipulated. So I'm going to start this video out with a confession. I'm going to be honest with you here. Before researching this, I was not a fan of the character of Tuor. I mean, I viewed him more or less the same way that I saw the Vanyar elves. People who just accepted what they were told and contributed very little, only by chance. And yes, I actually said that. His extended family may have been major fuck-ups at times and tremendously stubborn, but at least they were trying to do the right thing proactively and not just sitting around drinking while the rest of the world was essentially burned, literally. However, rereading the story for this, I now confess that I was wrong. Because I now see that Tuor was very much as nuanced and complex as any of the House of Hador, besides just being the good one and being the father of Earndil. Short plot points. Born to Rian after the Anarth and Nordiad War, wife of Huor. Raised by the elves of Mithrim after his mother leaves him to search for her husband and is never seen again. Lives like a refugee and kept from fighting the colonizers, see what I did there, directly until they are discovered by a band of Easterlings and orcs and fights them. Becomes a slave, beaten by Easterlings constantly until he escapes. Then proceeds to conduct a one-man war until he finds the old Noldor city of Viniamar, during which time he develops an affinity for the sea, encounters Umo, the man, and told to go to Gondolin. Eventually finds the city with the help of some elves and taken to see King Turgon, currently the High King of any Noldor left in Beleriand at that point. Stays with them by the command and love of the king, marries his daughter Idril, and has a son with her, Earndil. Everything seems to be cool until the city's location is then betrayed and he fights to save it along with everyone else, but fails. Told by Turgon and Idril to flee with the remaining survivors, thanks to a hidden tunnel that Idril had made prior due to her own intuition. And after some years of living in relative safety, with Idril sails off and is never seen again, leaving Earndil to be in charge of the people. Now, the reason I didn't like Tuor was because I was focused on the middle part of the story, his time in Gondolin. But looking at his early life, I see now that he was just as badass as his cousin, Turin. So clearly I underestimated this dude. The House of Hador all seem to have the drive to fight in their blood, because Tuor wanted to fight the orcs and Easterlings in open battle, just like Turin and, yes, Hurin. And I think it's implied by the Mithrim elves, who were just trying to survive and escape Morgoth's gaze, as it were, that they had a hard time holding them back most of the time. So not only is he like his extended family in the sense of wanting to fight, but is also similar in the sense of that they want to leave relative safety in order to kill said enemies, i.e. when his father left the city of Gondolin when he was a kid. Moreover, and surprisingly to me, I think also a large chunk of this comes from his mother, Rian, whom he remembered as an infant somehow, her telling him that it was because of the Easterlings that his father and their allies were betrayed and were killed. So between this and his experiences, I think it's fair to say that he pretty much hates Easterlings, and it showed. And it sounds like all this kind of came to a head when he finally was captured, having refusing to run anymore and fought the orcs and Eastlings who were trying to capture him and the elves. Now, being a refugee is hard, okay, but being a slave is much worse. And Tuor was a slave, and this was another reason why I've come to respect the character more. That he still had the Hador drive to fight and kill as many enemies as possible before, after some time, making his escape to the Western Sea thanks to Umo. So in a way, it's very much a similar story to what happens with Turin. Now, this is where things change, because this is where he has the encounter with the Vala Umo. Tuor is one of only 3 mortals ever to have ever encountered a Vala. It would be like being a completely reckless asshole before suddenly seeing the face of God. Everything changes after that point because it puts a new perspective on things. And that's what happened with Tuor. Learning that he had been chosen by Umo with a special mission also gave the angry young man some direction and purpose besides just killing Easterlings, basically. Because for Tuor, life had become at this point about kill or be killed or enslaved. And as a member of the House of Hador, guess what option he was choosing? He is choosing the side of violence every time. That being said, these were factors that Turin, however, did not have. Turin never encountered a Vala after his own escape and capture and torment by orcs, but instead encountered a broken elf escapee from Angband, Gwendor, and then once in Nargothrond, while he performed well as a warrior because, duh, he's Hurin's kid, it also did not give him purpose and direction to direct his energies. Basically, that he didn't have an encounter with anyone who was able to literally overwhelm him with their power and majesty to the point that his own ego and issues fell aside. Now, there's a question of maybe Melian could have done this because she's a Maiar, but maybe because she didn't appear in that form to him, it didn't happen. So who's to say? Either way, point being is that Turin didn't have the opportunities essentially that Tuor had. Now, perhaps the greatest tragedy between these two sons of great fathers was the fact that their single encounter with each other was by chance, and that also nothing ever came of it. In fact, Tuor only heard his unknown cousin shouting an elf maiden's name in the distance. And to me, this is always one of the saddest parts of the Silmarillion. So close and yet so far. And who's to say what would have happened if the two had gotten together and done who knows what, basically. But regardless, once Tuor is in Gondolin, it's his first real break in life that he gets, because Gondolin and Doriath at this point were the only two real safe zones for anyone trying to stay out of Angband's way. Its beauty is said to be on par with that of Turin and Valinor, which also serves to further quell Tuor's fire and rage, to the point that when Turgon decides to refuse almost command to leave the city, and also because of you knew his father, commands that Tuor never leave the city as well, Tuor doesn't challenge it, unlike his father and his uncle. The hot-bloodedness of the House of Hador only returns to him during the fall of the city at this point. Having said that, I think that if Tuor had not gotten to the Western Sea nor encountered Umo, that honestly he may have tried to do the same thing as his father, his uncle, and his cousin. Demand to get back into the dirt of the world and do what he could to help those suffering or to make those who were causing the suffering pay with their lives. Tuor's relationship with Earndil too is also interesting because, if I had to guess, I think that she may have been impressed by something in his father that then projected onto him. This is implied by what the Silmarillion says, that Tuor was accepted within Gondolin society because of the influence of his father, whom unfortunately he never met. I don't think Earndil had a romantic interest in Huor's father, just that, going by what it's implied, she, like the other Noldor, were impressed by him in some way, shape, or form, and that this helped his son in his relationship with Earndil. This isn't Game of Thrones after all, where something like that would 100% be the case. So it was at this point that originally I did not like the character of Tuor for this particular reason. And now that I've reconsidered things, I now see that he has pretty much earned it, as well as his good fortunes not being the product of sheer laziness, but happening by chance, as it were. I'm not a big fan of fate, but if you want to say fate, go ahead. So, kudos to Tuor here. However, Gondolin is eventually found out, and Tuor now once again becomes a warrior, defending the city viciously, and even his own family when his Sindarin elven cousin-in-law, Maeglin, who, unbeknownst to him, apparently was also in love with his wife, tried to then take her by force or kill her and their son. If they ever do an adaptation of this needs to be a very epic fight. I'm just saying it right now. Anyhow, after this, Tuor becomes the leader of the survivors by the appointee of Turgon, who has now fallen into the Finwë family trait of extreme emotional despair and refuses to leave, choosing to stay and die with the rest of his immediate family and warriors, save Earndil. So, what makes Tuor so special in the House of Hador's storied history is that he gained something that the others did not: balance. Tuor started out just like his extended family and displayed all the characteristics of that house. But his life experiences and own choices lead him to develop a perspective where violence and war were not the only ways to live, nor was despair and just survival. And it was for this particular reason that I've gained a newfound respect for Tuor of the House of Hador. This is Miller Philosopher. and welcome to the last of my series on the House of Hador, covering Earndil. Now, I think that Earndil is the culmination of the personal war that has gone on between the House of Hador and Morgoth. Ever since the death of Hador, there has been something of a running beef between them, I think. First, just as a proxy of Morgoth's war with the Noldor elves overall, and then starting with Hurin and Huor becoming much more personal and intimate. And while I don't believe in a fated curse causing the misery on her inside the fam, I also don't deny that Morgoth definitely had extremely evil intentions directed at them specifically, and that he probably tried to. Now, enter Earndil, who isn't just a salvation at the first age, but, in my opinion, is also the avenger of the House of Hador upon Morgoth. Hear me out. Short points. Son of Tuor and Earndil in Gondolin. As a child, survived the sack of the city and escaped along with his fam and other survivors to the coast of the Bay of Balar in the far southeastern portion of Beleriand, where they met up with other survivors from Doriath, which had also fallen some years earlier. Parents leave him eventually, and he marries Elwing, the daughter of the now deceased High King Tuor. Searched for his parents across the seas, but never found him. And also fathered half-elven Elrond and Elros. His home is attacked and destroyed by the Sons of Fëanor attempting to regain the Cimmeril that was in Elwing's possession as a family heirloom, and then retrieves his wife, who escapes at sea and in desperation now sails to the far west in search of Valinor, which had previously been banned to everyone from the east of Middle-earth. Arrives and is called before the Valar, pleads the case of the dire situation of Beleriand is now in, and causing the west to move to war against Morgoth. Is made also as a consequence to never step foot on Middle-earth again by sailing across the skies in his now blessed ship with the Cimmeril, and takes part in the final days of the War of Wrath by killing the boss-ass dragon, Calagon the Black. Now, these accolades are why he's known to the lore and to fans of Tolkien as Bright Earndil and the savior of the peoples of Beleriand. But here's the thing. It's much more loaded than that, I believe, because of three particular points. One, as the ambassador to the Valar. Two, as the fulfillment of the Valar's prophecy regarding who was going to convince them to go to Middle-earth. Three, and probably one of my most controversial statements, the fulfillment of Fëanor's prophecy. And four, the avenger of his family upon Morgoth. So, point one. Earndil is not the first person from Middle-earth to present the case for going to war against Morgoth. Ummo, always a staunch and longtime ally of the Free Peoples from the very beginning, had long ago wanted to go to war to free Beleriand, and even wanted the elves originally to stay in Middle-earth rather than be moved to Valinor as was originally planned. Then there's also Luthien, whom, in her enchanted song the Mandos, also told of the suffering of the people at that time. Ummo's case was rejected because it, quote, wasn't the right time.
Live long and prosper.
I'm sure he was really happy about that. And Luthien's main reason for making the case for Middle-earth was to plead her case for her and Beren, which I'm not saying is bad, that's just what the situation was. Now, what Earndil had going for him, however, was the Cimmeril itself, which the Valar took as a symbol that he was the chosen one to truly represent the people of Middle-earth. He is the third mortal to have come face to face with any of the Valar. I'm sure that this was beyond overwhelming, but I would like to think that he would have communicated the overwhelming frustration of the people of Middle-earth that the Valar had basically ignored them for so long, leaving the looming threat of one of their own to run buck wild across the world and waiting till the 11th hour to finally intervene, after nearly the entire northwest of Middle-earth has been completely wrecked. He also, I think, represented the loopholes that humanity often presented to the divine. Mandos wanted him executed because at some point it was made law that mortals cannot walk in immortal lands. But again, it was the Cimmeral and what it represents that saves him, yet at the cost of still having to pay the penalty of never setting foot on his home again, nor seeing the sons that he left behind. Point 2. Earndil is regarded by the Valar as the instrument of fate because of the Cimmeral in his and his wife's possession, that it had effectively led them into Valinor, defeating many of the mystical traps and snares that the Valar had set up centuries before. Now being an instrument of fate essentially made Earndil more than just mortal per se, protected from execution and being the necessary impetus for the Valar to finally act and get off their asses. Who made this prophecy though? Manwë states it when refusing Ulmo's request to go to war, and Huor, Earndil's grandfather, predicted this outcome at the time of his death at the end of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. So then was it Uru who inspired this then? On the one hand, you could say yes, but on the other, you could also say no because of how in the book, The Nature of Middle-earth, it says that there was supposed to be a line where Uru chastises the Valar for choosing to wait so long to intervene. This takes me into point 3. What many people often forget is that even before Manwë and Huor predicted the result of Earndil's representation, that Fëanor long before had been the first to actually predict that the Valar would follow him back east. This happened after the infamous Alqualande incident and when his faction of rebelling Noldor stole the Teleri ships and sailed across the sea. A pissed off Mandos appears and pronounces the curse upon his family and all the Noldor that depart. But Fëanor, being Fëanor, gives zero fucks, as one of my listeners has pointed out, and mouths off to the Doomsman's face, rebuking the Valar for their hesitancy and pronouncing his own prophecy instead. And as a side note, and Alqualande aside, this is also why people who are Fëanor fans love him so damn much. Now, Earndil is the instrument of that prophecy as well. I would find it hard to believe that not one of the Valar, Ulmo at the least, would recall this as Earndil presents his case and the decision is finally made to go back to war for the sake of Middle-earth. That this was exactly what the Mad High King of the Noldor had foretold, thereby also implying that the Valar themselves didn't have the ultimate authority over Farsight and that they too could also actually be under it when pronounced by lesser beings, as it were. And the fourth and final and most important point is that Earndil is also the avenger of his family on Morgoth. Now, hear me out. Morgoth's feud with the House of Hador really kicked off with what he did to Hurin and his family. Hurin had told Morgoth that he would not win the war, and you can argue that that was also a prophecy if you want, regardless of whatever happened to him and his family. And Morgoth crashed out and cursed him. He made it his personal mission to make his family suffer directly. Now, Huor's family was an extension of that, in my opinion, because Morgoth had also caused the suffering that affected them, going back to the founder of their family's death, Hador, at the hand of Morgoth's armies. Earndil's grandparents died tragically. His parents and himself suffered the loss of their home and the agony of migration to the sea just to escape Morgoth, only to then be accosted by the now mad sons of Fëanor that are still left, following the oath of their long-dead father. An oath that was made because Morgoth had stolen the Cimmerals out of spite, greed, and malice before coming to Middle-earth and kickstarting the entire Beleriand Wars in the first place. Now, maybe Earndil knew it and maybe he didn't, but the man was carrying a lot of generational beef on his shoulders. And don't forget, this guy is still a member of the House of Hador. He even participated in the War of Wrath by taking down Calagon the Black, my favorite dragon unfortunately, without any command nor hint from the Valar or Elves to do so. No one asked for his help. And it was strictly on his own volition, which means, guess what? The blood of the House of Hador kicks in, in Earndil at this point in the war. The desire to fight, even if the cause was hopeless and against all odds. The desire to sit not idly by while the world suffered and burned. Earndil, however, is the first of his house to now have the power to do something about it effectively. So, I find it extremely poetic and appropriate that the cause of Morgoth's final downfall comes from the family whom he had shown the most spite and malice, even if, yes, it was extended family. And yes, I know there is a draft where Turin is supposed to have been the one avenging the fam, and yes, I would have liked that as well, to be honest, but it also appears in the final and canceled apocalyptic war in the future of Middle-earth, so that being the case, we're stuck with Earndil. Now, my final point on Earndil and this family series as a whole is that it's quite easy for all of them to get lost in the mist of legends regarding the First Age. That the personal humanity, their strengths, their flaws, their victories, and their losses pale in the light of the overall narrative of the Silmarillion and its legacy moving forward. And that the tales and legends are often embellished over time, as Gandalf says in Fellowship of the Ring. As Bright Earndil, he is the final product of this, and his actions shouldn't ever be understated, and he deserves all the praise that he gets. However, what also can't be lost is the man himself, and what it cost him and the rest of his family to have these tales to be embellished in the first place. Did he have abandonment issues because of both of his parents had left and were never seen again? Did he feel tremendous guilt at never being able to see his sons again? Or did he feel anger at the Valar for imposing upon him that consequence for something that they themselves had been told and chastised for an action that they should have taken long before? Or did Valinor and its bliss give him some sort of deeper sense of understanding and peace? And did it quell any kind of anger and grief that he might have felt prior, like what happened to his father when he first encountered Ummo and arrived in Gondolin? That, for me, is the importance of the House of Hador, a family that is so steeped in legend that remembering that they were also human can be an effort worthy of Hurin himself. Thank you for sticking around for the last of this series, and this is the Miller Philosopher. Take care.